So let's get started. So just so you know, this presentation is approximately 45 minutes long. We will have about 15 minutes at the end for you to ask questions, but at any time, if you want to ask a question, feel free to type it into the chat window, and I will respond to them at the end. Additionally, I'd like to say that if you don't catch any of this or you're missing a part of it, you want to show it to other people around your office, we will be putting this up on YouTube afterwards. So just look at the DevFacto YouTube channel and you should be able to see the recording of this presentation. Okay? So first off, my name is David McMillan and I'm the Portals and Collaboration Practice Lead for DevFacto Technologies. I've been in IT for over 20 years now. And since 2003, I've actually concentrated mainly on SharePoint, and in recent years, mainly on the governance of SharePoint and on information architecture. So my background is I have a master's in business administration in the management of information systems and a Bachelor of Science in operations management, as well as several premier certifications from Microsoft. So let's get right into it. So the premise of this presentation was really brought up by the idea of the statement, Mom always said life was like a box of chocolates, you never know what you're going to get, which is from the Forrest Gump movie. And what that actually brings up is it brings up an issue with information architecture. And that's why I wanted to make this presentation on a box of chocolates. What's wrong with the box of chocolates that you never know what you're going to get? Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to look at the purpose and the value of our information architecture. What are we trying to do with it, and what's causing it to be ineffective? We're also going to look at key components that we can implement that will make it a successful implementation of information architecture. So not just how is it bad with the box of chocolates, but what can we do to improve it? So we're just going to go into a brief introduction of information architecture, and I just want to point out that information architecture is really about the art or science of labeling information. It's about the usability of information and the findability of information. So a lot of people have this idea about information architecture as being user experience, and in a lot of sense that is the outcome of it. When we talk about digital design, that is one component of it. It's that usability, right? Making it nice for people to use, making it easy for people to use. When we're looking at the findability aspects, we're looking at the building of the structure of our information so that it is easy for people to find, and not only easy for them to find, but easy to find the right information, okay? And to make sure that they have the right information. So really, when we're looking at information architecture, we're looking at three components. We're looking at the users, right, and how they interact with that information, the context of the information that they're looking for. So for example, there may be two documents about the same thing, vacation leave, but maybe vacation leave for field workers in your organization is different than vacation for an office worker. So context becomes important. And then the last is the actual content. Getting the right content to the right people with the right context. What this presentation is going to concentrate the most on is the content itself. Okay, so how the users are accessing that content. So why is information architecture important to your organization? First of all, it reduces the time in finding your correct information. So it's going to make people more productive, in other words. It's also going to ensure that we don't have duplicate information and that we know that we're accessing the right information. And then the last is that we're not getting the wrong information and working with it. So how many organizations do you have where you go in and you access a document, you're 50% of the way through your job and you find out, oh, I've been using the wrong document. That's an old version, right? The purpose of information architecture is to make that not happen. Okay? The second is it gives us a better return on investment because we're better using our technology. Okay? It's the idea that it should be fit for purpose. So the technology should be something that we're intending to use it for, and therefore we're using it more efficiently as well. And then finally, the ability to allow users to do what they want to do without inhibiting their work. So giving them the ability to do what they want without having to know a whole lot of extra steps to do it, that's also important to our information architecture. We talked about usability and findability, right? So the ability to use it easily, not having to do a whole lot of steps, that's a big part of it. So if we look at a box of chocolates, it actually has an information architecture. Okay? Really, everything in our world has some type of information architecture, some of it good, some of it bad. Because remember, information architecture is about you, the user, the context of something that you're using, and the content that you're accessing. So we can apply that to pretty much anything in the world. And in this case, we're going to apply it to a box of chocolates. So a box of chocolates does have information architecture. It's just really poorly done. Okay, so for example, how many times have you opened up a box of chocolates and you get the little card inside? Okay, that card is the information architecture. Now, when I did this presentation last weekend, actually the chocolates, I handed out some boxes of chocolates for us to visualize and eat. And it didn't have a card at all. There was no card at all. It looked basically what you see right here on the screen. There were a bunch of different shapes, and you had to guess which one is which. So because this is so poorly implemented, that's why you never know what you're going to get, right? Normally, that little card looks something like this. It's got all these different shapes and patterns of chocolates, and then when you get to the box, it's not quite the same, right? Like this is pretty good. We can kind of tell the difference between all these different chocolates. And I say kind of because we'll talk about reasons why they don't necessarily match up. But the other thing is, it may not be this simple. It may look something like this, where we've got all the same shapes, and then really we're just trying to determine, like, what's the difference between the dark praline, the Cointreau, and the whiskey. From this card, I can't see, right? It's just not possible for me to tell the difference. So what do I have to do? Taste test. Now, how many of you have taken a chocolate, eaten it, thinking you were getting a certain flavor, and finding out, oh, gee, that's the one I hate? I know I do it all the time. I don't really like the coffee chocolates, but I love the caramel chocolates, and unfortunately, they always seem to have the same shapes. Okay, another thing is consistency, right? Sometimes when you open up a box of chocolates, they're not consistent. Like, I would never be able to pick out what the differences are in this box of chocolates because there is no consistency in their designs. If you look at it, I mean, and they all have swirls on the top. The only thing I have that is consistent is the fact that there's white and there's milk and there's dark chocolate. Okay, so what's causing this ineffective information architecture? Well, really, we have three different things that cause it. We have ambiguity, which is the lack of uniqueness in it. We have variation, which I'm referring to the lack of consistency. And then we have ignorance, a lack of information. Okay, we're going to examine each of these, and that's really what the goal of today is we're going to examine each of these causes of ineffective IA and figure out how we can address them and how we can make them better. So, if we look at ambiguity, ambiguity refers to something not having a clear meaning. Or, if you really want to not have a clear meaning, you could take the second definition, which is ambiguity is something that's ambiguous. which gives you no definition at all. Also with this, I've included the antonyms because they often help clarify what really is meant by something. So the antonyms are the opposites, right? So if it's not ambiguous, it is clear, right? It's providing us clarity, it's providing us clearness, it's obvious, and it's plain. Okay, so it gives us the clear identification of something, if you will. So if we look at the ambiguity, it's really caused by three different things. We have a limited variety when we look at chocolates of their colors, their shapes, and their designs. It's also not organized in a way that makes sense, typically. In some cases, you may get the card where it actually has like a pattern in the square, and you're trying to figure out, because it just shows shapes and the name of the shape, and then you're trying to figure out where exactly that exists in the box. And that's great, but it's not very well organized, right? And then the other one is often there's too many different kinds of chocolates. The chocolates that we opened on the weekend, there were 25 chocolates in the box. Of them, I think there were 15 different varieties. So 15 varieties in a box of 25 chocolates. You can see like 2 of each where there's one single one. But that much in a small box is a lot of variation, right? And that too many options makes it more confusing. So how can we fix that? Well, if we can't change the physical attributes, which we can, but we're going to talk about that a bit later, one of the things we can do is we can sort them, or what we call indexing. We can actually index our information so that we can find it better. The other thing we can do is we can filter it. We can reduce the number of options that we have, the varieties that we have, so that you're less likely to get a wrong one. So, what exactly is sorting when we talk about it, or indexing? Really, it's the process of assigning objects with attribute values. So what we're saying is, you know what, I've got a box of chocolates, and I've got some columns, and I've got some rows. When I look at the chocolates, I can say, you know what, the caramels will be in column 1, row 1, okay? Kind of giving us a grid reference. That's kind of the idea of an index. It's going to give us a grid reference. What that allows us to do is it also allows us to group and sort them. So as the picture shows there, you can have a column of the same types of chocolates. So all the caramels fall in column 3, as an example. All the strawberry creams are in column 4, or something similar. The idea is, if you have them in the nice columns, you're less likely to get it wrong. Okay? So that's really what indexing is going to do for us. Give us either a clear spot that it's located in. And how would we tell the spots? Well, we would have to label the boxes so that we'd have like a 1, 2, 3, 4 across one side and then 1, 2, 3, 4 down the other side. And something that labels it as a row or a column, as an example. Or exactly as the picture is, we use some other tools as well, but then we have nice straight lines. Now, we talked about filtering, and filtering is the idea of reduction in variety. This is one thing that the chocolate companies have actually already done. It's one of the few things in information architecture they've done, but Pot of Gold realized that was one of the big issues that they had with their box of chocolates. They had too much variety, people weren't getting the right chocolates, and it provided a bad user experience. So what they did was they came out with these specialized box of chocolates. Okay, so for example, the picture is the caramel collection. So everything in the box is caramels. So rather than dealing with 50 different varieties in a box of Pot of Gold, we now have 5 different varieties in a box of caramels. So what that's doing is it's reducing the variety, right? Gives you less chance to pick a wrong one, and it ensures that the information that you're getting has been provided so that you're less likely to pick something bad. Okay, the next thing we talked about was variation. Now, variation is actually a manufacturing cause, if you will, because if you look at the definition, it's something that is similar but different in some way. Okay, so for example, we're talking about the same chocolate looking differently. So the antonym of that is for it to be fixed or stabilized. And by the way, all of these definitions come from merriam-webster.com, so if you wanted to look them up, I'm not making up the definitions. Some of them are just funny in themselves. But yeah, so we're looking to fix or stabilize what we're getting. So the actual cause of variation is a lack of quality control. Now, in the case of chocolates, it's very difficult to get stabilized quality control because they are handmade, right? And the other is there's not enough variety in the differentiators between them, or the attributes, if you will. So what we can do to fix it is we can actually improve the consistency by building some structure around them. And then the next is we can build some clarity by improving the differentiators, deciding on specific differentiators that are much easier to do and less likely to cause variety. So what does improved consistency mean? Well, in the case of chocolates, we would need to implement some type of quality control system. Now, if you remember back at the beginning, I have a degree in operations management, so I automatically go back to the quality control that's in manufacturing. And that is, we manage statistical fluctuations or variances in the process using standard deviations. And it's the same idea with handmade chocolates, but it's a lot harder for you to control that, because I mean, just think of yourself. If you were to take a piece of paper and write the letter S on the page 50 times, how many of those are going to look the exact same, right? Handmade doesn't make it less good, it just makes it more unique, right? So, I mean, and this is the catch with chocolates. You don't reject a chocolate because the design on it is a bit different, because I'm pretty sure that chocolate still tastes good, right? It's about the taste of the chocolate, not about the design of the chocolate. So it's really hard to be rejecting chocolates just because they got the design wrong. So instead, what we'll need to do is we'll need to figure out some other ways to improve consistency of them. And remember, I talked about the patterns. Now, in an information architecture environment that deals with actual metadata, or the data that defines it, we usually look at tools that are things called vocabularies and taxonomies. The idea of a vocabulary is exactly that, controlling the variances. Vocabularies are a controlled set of terms that you can use. And I'm just going to stray away from chocolates here for a second to talk about that, because, I mean, the reason why you guys are in here is because of who we are. We're information architecture people, so we are dealing with organizing your information. When we talk about a vocabulary, and when anybody talks about a vocabulary, we're talking about the fact that we're controlling the inputs so that we can control the ability for you to find something. I use the example of a country like the United States. If I was to ask each of you how you enter it into the system, you may have a different way. Some of you will enter it as US, some of you will enter it as USA, some of you will enter it as United States, and some of you who really like to type will enter in the United States of America. However, when we're trying to search by that, that makes it more difficult for us to find what we're looking for. So instead, we implement a vocabulary, And then we utilize some tools to make it so that everybody enters the same thing. So for example, if rather than let you type it in, I give you a drop-down box that says choose a country, and you choose United States from the drop-down list, everybody will get United States where that data is relevant. That's the idea of a vocabulary. The other thing a vocabulary gives us is it gives us some central control over that. So it's not just a drop-down box. It's actually centralized control content that operates across many different areas. And those actually work inside the idea of a taxonomy. And a taxonomy is a structure of data, if you will. It's kind of a hierarchy, families and children. And we'll talk about taxonomies a lot more a bit later. But taxonomies are about inheriting information down through different types. So, already defined these, but as I said, we're going to use words or terms to control the inputs. United States was my example, and then the taxonomy is a structured set of data. Okay, so clarity. Clarity is about improving our differentiators. Now with chocolates, we don't have too many differentiators that we can use. We have the shape of the chocolate, we have the color of the chocolate, and we have the texture or pattern of the chocolate. Now when we talk about the shape of the chocolate, we can manipulate the shape without changing the flavor of the chocolate. A circular caramel tastes the same as a square caramel, is that idea. So we can manipulate the shape without affecting our result, which is the flavor. We can also affect the color slightly. And I put a caveat there because, of course, we only have 3 different types of chocolate, if you will. We have our white chocolates, which have no cocoa in them. We have our milk chocolates, which are very light cocoa chocolates. And then we have our dark chocolates, which are a heavy percentage of cocoa. However, because we have white chocolates, we can actually affect the color of the white chocolate using food coloring, which is kind of the example at the bottom. I show you a milk chocolate, and then I show you red, green, purple, orange, right? Each of those we know are different flavors. And that's kind of the idea behind it. We can get some colors, and whether it's a dot of white chocolate on the top so that it doesn't truly affect the flavor. Maybe it's a dot of white chocolate that's colored red, or it's a dot of white chocolate that's colored green. That gives us additional varieties that aren't currently used in a regular box of chocolates. So let's look at that a bit more. So if we look at the combinations that those 3 things for clarity can give us, if I said, you know what, let's limit it to 5 shapes. So we have a square, we have a rectangle, we have a circle, we have a semicircle, right, or a moon or whatever you want to call it, and maybe we have a triangle. Okay, that gives us 5 shapes, all of them clear to identify between each other. There shouldn't be much confusion for us in there. And that's why I limited it to 5. When you start getting into, oh, maybe we'll have a pentagon or we'll have a hexagon or an octagon, then it starts to get confusing. So didn't want to do that. Keep it as simple as possible. We then look at this and we say, okay, well, what about the colors? Remember I talked about the ability to add some type of food coloring into a white chocolate? Well, I'm not talking about changing the whole color of the chocolate. I'm more talking about changing the color of the designs on them. So the next line down is design. I'm saying, you know what, we could make that design with a red, maybe it's a red line or a green line or a blue line or a white line, or maybe it's a dot, right? Something minor that isn't going to affect our outcome to any great extent. And then we can look at our designs. We can look at, you know what, maybe I have 3 lines on it, or 2 lines or 1 line. Keeping them as lines, and you notice I'm not talking about squigglies, lines, or anything like that, because that's actually where the confusion comes from in a box of chocolates. It comes from that idea of, oh yeah, there are all these different patterns, and I'm not sure which one I'm getting. Well, if we left them as lines and dots, it's a lot easier for us to tell, right? Maybe we have 2 lines with 3 dots up the middle. Okay, but only one chocolate gets that, as an example. That makes it a lot clearer than, say, if it was 2 squigglies going on an angle across the chocolate. That's just not good architecture, because then, who knows, maybe there's one that's 3 squigglies, but maybe tighter squiggles or something, going the opposite way on the chocolate. Well, if the chocolate's turned, it's still got an issue, right? And then we have more confusion. So what I've done is I've actually said, well, okay, so if we look at up to 3 lines, up to 3 dots, and up to a combination of dots and lines of up to 3, it gives us a combination that looks something like the bottom in blue. We have 5 different shapes, 4 different colors, 3 different lines, 3 different dots, and 3 different combined, which gives us a total of 540 different unique combinations that we could have from that. But what I say is, you know what, if we used all of them, it gets more confusing. So I typically will take only 1/3 of those, which is 180, right? 180 different varieties of combination we can use to clarify what chocolate is which. And you see more today in the modern chocolate stores. You're seeing a lot more of that uniqueness being used. They're using other things as well. They're using some like pattern tops. If you remember back at the beginning when we were talking about the indexing, the sorting, those chocolates had a pattern on top, right? And we have other tools that are available, but really, even without those, we still have a huge amount of combinations that will allow us to keep it unique. Now, the third part of our conversation is really about ignorance. Now, ignorance in the true definition of the word, which is a lack of information. So, I like this statement, ignorance is bliss. However, with chocolates, ignorance is bliss until you get a bad chocolate, right? The one that you don't like. Happens to me all the time. That's kind of the face I make too. Not quite that bad, but pretty close. Okay, so how can we solve the problem of ignorance? Well, ignorance is really a lack of knowledge, understanding, or education. I like the second part of that definition too. It's a state of being ignorant, which actually creates, if I was to take out the first part of the definition and only use the second part of that definition, it would create ignorance in itself. But really, the antonyms of it are familiarity, awareness, acquaintance, right? And cognizance. Of course, cognizance isn't that important to us when we're talking about chocolates. We're talking about our familiarity with the chocolates themselves. The reason why we pick bad chocolates is because we don't eat chocolates every day. Well, I'm not supposed to eat chocolates every day. So part of that is, yeah, making sure that I'm picking the right chocolates is coming out of, well, you know what? I don't know. I'm not sure which one is which. I've seen some of these chocolate connoisseurs, they'll pick up a chocolate and sniff it, and they know exactly what kind of chocolate it is. They don't even look at the pattern. I'm not one of those guys. I eat all chocolate. Doesn't matter. Okay. So our ignorance is actually caused by a lack of structure. Now, if you remember, we talked about structure previously. And we're going to talk about structure a lot more now. Because we're going to talk about how we could actually build some structure into chocolate. And then the other is we're not provided enough information. Remember, we're only provided that little card, and it says salted caramel, and it's got a picture. Well, what good is that, right? We can fix it by doing something called classification. We can classify our chocolates, which is building structured metadata. Now, I want to point out the term structured metadata because we used that term previously already in this presentation. So I'm just going to first give you what classification is. So according to ISO 15489, which by the way is the International Organization for Standardization's definition for records management. And it says that it is the identification and arrangement of business activities and or records into categories, and then it's about structured conventions, methods, and procedural rules. So if we take that and we look back to what I was talking about with taxonomies, if a taxonomy is the structured set of metadata, and classification is the logically structured conventions, methods, and procedural rules, then really they are very much the same thing. The taxonomy is the structure for classification. Okay? And that's truly what taxonomies are. They're structured classifications of information. The best way to think of a taxonomy is to think of the animal kingdom, which is a strict taxonomy that exists in the world. Okay? What scientists have done is they've structured it according to the genus and family of different types of animals and how they all interrelate. It's the same idea that we do with our information or with our chocolates. Chocolates can have the same type of hierarchy. So if we look at the taxonomy, we build it using metadata, which we define something called a content type. And in those content types, some of that metadata may be a vocabulary. Okay, remember vocabularies are a fixed, we'll call it a store of terms. And actually, in the SharePoint sense, we use the term term store to talk about our vocabularies. It's where we store all of our vocabularies in the term store. So, so when we look at that, we're going to look at our tools that we use to build the taxonomy, and then let's look at building the taxonomy for chocolates. So the tools that we have, metadata, content types, vocabularies, and how they relate to chocolates, well, it's pretty simple. If we look at chocolates as a family, so chocolates are a family, maybe we have some information that needs to be provided. That information is called metadata. Metadata is data that defines data. Okay, yes, it's a circular reference, just kind of like those definitions. And what it refers to attributes. Okay, the attributes that help us define what something is. So everything has attributes. You have attributes. You have your first name, you have your middle name, you have your last name, you have your social insurance number, you have your email address, you have your phone number. All of those are attributes that help to define who you are. Okay? Now, there are other attributes as well. Some are physical, some are not, right? And we just talked about a bunch of non-physical attributes, right? Your email address, your phone number, those aren't physical attributes. However, your eye color, your hair color, your height, where you were born, those are all physical attributes about you. Okay? So there's a lot of information, especially about a person. I mean, everything that ever happens to you is really metadata. It's what defines you, right? Your history defines you, and that's what metadata is. It defines your history. So let's look at chocolates themselves. We look at chocolate metadata. Maybe we say, you know what, I talked about it earlier, we have 3 different kinds of chocolates. We have white chocolate, we have milk chocolate, we have dark chocolate. And then maybe we have what's inside it, which would be the fill type. Maybe the fill is chocolate, right? It's a pure chocolate, so it has no fill, right? So a solid chocolate would have no fill, or maybe it's a caramel, so caramel would be the fill, or maybe it's a ganache, so maybe a ganache would be the fill. And those are actually going to break out later on. We'll talk about this idea of parents and children, but really right now we're talking about the chocolate family, and all of these things apply to it, right? Another thing that we have, the color of it, right? Remember we talked about the color, the shape, and the patterns, about ways that we could differentiate. Well, anything that differentiates something from another is typically a piece of metadata. So we have here our color, our shape, and our surface pattern. Those can all be defined to help us differentiate from one chocolate to another. And then, on top of it, we talked about the indexing, the sorting of the information. Well, box location would be another one that would be good to have. And I mean, we could go on and on and on, but for our example, these are a good starting point. Now, the idea of metadata, using it in content types, is it's again kind of like that family. The content type of chocolates is its own little family. And maybe we have some other families that exist. So for example, maybe we have candies. Maybe they're hard candies or soft candies as an idea, right? And candied apples, and maybe you have different types of candied apples. And then we have different types of ice creams, right? All of those may fall into a larger family called confections or something like that. That's completely up to the design of the organization. And in this case, because I'm defining it, I say, yeah, you know what? Those are the parents that I have, and then we can have subtypes from the parent, or what we call children. Okay, so parents can have children. So in the case, I've used the example of candied apples in this case because we've been dealing with purely chocolate so far. But let's look at candied apples for a second. Maybe when we look at candied apples, we have caramel apples, candied apples, and chocolate apples. And maybe we have more. Maybe we have peanut butter apples and things like that. I don't know, right? But what I'm saying is, here's an example of the candied apple and then the caramel apple, and so on. Now, very much like a parent-child relationship in the world, the parent-child relationship in the classification of information is similar. We inherit in our metadata from our parent in a taxonomy. So the chocolates have all of their core metadata there, right? The chocolate type, the fill type, the color, the shape, the surface pattern, the box location. However, maybe based off of fill type, we have a child called caramel chocolates. Okay, now the caramel chocolates, they still have the chocolate type, the fill type, the color, the shape, the surface pattern, the box location, but then they have some additional information, which is the type of caramel that's inside of it, and maybe whether or not it's salted. Okay, now if we actually look at that information, maybe fill type doesn't change, maybe shape doesn't change, right? For example, pot of gold, all caramels are always squares. Okay, so maybe we fix the shape when we come to the child, or we fix the fill type. In this case, we're definitely fixing fill type, right? Because if it doesn't have caramel in it, what's it doing in the caramel chocolate child family? And that's the idea of hierarchy, right? So we start out with a core piece of metadata for a type. We inherit that down through, and we may fix it. In the case of SharePoint, we have three choices when we're inheriting. We can make it mandatory, which means they have to enter it. We can make it optional, or we can hide it. Now, in the case of hiding it, what we typically do is we fix the value and hide it, right? Caramels, I don't need to see the fill type anymore. So I fix the value and I hide it. And that way, people don't need to see the fill type for caramel chocolates. They know it's a caramel chocolate. Now, you say, okay, so we talked about the vocabularies and fixing the inputs so that we can search. Well, in the case of vocabularies, we have a few things we need to consider when we look at a vocabulary. First off, is vocabularies have only certain times that we would want to use them, because they do take a lot of effort to set up. The first is that we need some type of consistency across multiple locations. Okay? And the second is we want to centrally control it. Okay? So by central control, we can actually maintain all of that in one location and push it across all the sites. The consistency makes sure that it can be searchable across all sites. And then what we do is we provide the consumers of that information a simplified interface. So rather than text fields where they have to type it in, we give them things like drop boxes or radio buttons or check boxes where they don't have to type anything in. That's really the advantages that we gain from having that vocabulary. So if we actually look at vocabularies when it refers to the chocolate, really we already identified a few things that don't change. So for example, chocolate types, right? We talked about dark chocolate, milk chocolate, white chocolate. And just a point, one of the things that was brought up was, okay, well, chocolate types, well, there are many different cocoa levels for dark chocolates. Well, that's great, because what we can do is when we reach down, maybe we have a child type called dark chocolates, right? And they have a cocoa percentage. So what is the percentage of cocoa for that dark chocolate? Is it a 50%? Is it a 60%? Is it a 70%? An 80%? All of those can be different types of chocolates as well, right? Another one that we have is possibly fill types, right? However, fill types bring up something else that's important, something called a folksonomy. Now, the idea of folksonomies are we need our user input. I mean, normally, because we're a webinar, I can't really ask you guys how many types of fills that you know about. But no matter what, it's going to be different for all of us. I mean, we didn't even talk about grasshopper fills, ant fills. I mean, all of these weird things that people put inside chocolates, those all would be a fill type. So what we would typically do here is we would establish, rather than a fixed vocabulary, we establish a folksonomy, allowing people to define parts of the taxonomy. However, one point I want to make is folksonomy is a big term right now in information architecture, but folksonomies are a temporary solution. They're meant to build a taxonomy. So the idea is, for a time, you have a flexible taxonomy. And that's really what a folksonomy is, a flexible taxonomy. And you allow users to manipulate it. But at some point, you have to start solidifying it. You can't leave it dynamic, because then it's just like having no taxonomy at all. So what we typically do is we build it as a folksonomy and we review it regularly and start locking it down. So just so you know, if that's a question that you had, that's the purpose of a folksonomy. Okay? The other things that we have, color, shape, and surface pattern, I mean, we talked about that already. Maybe we want to fix those in a vocabulary. Only give them, it's a square, it's a semicircle, it's a rectangle. Those are what they're allowed to define it as. That's it. That's all they're allowed. Okay? And then the last one is box location. Now, typically you wouldn't use an index for a vocabulary, but possibly. Because, I mean, indexing number, a numeric index versus an indexed field that's going to be searchable, like the caramel ganache, is something a bit different, and I just want to point that out because it is still grouping all the caramels together. But when we talk about box location, we're really talking about grid references. Really hard to limit the choices there. So some information will be vocabulary, some information will not. That's really an evaluation, as we talked about. Need to use it across multiple sites, needs to be fixed for searching. Okay, those are your two things you need to make sure you're, because if users aren't going to search by it, there's no point in building a vocabulary for it. Okay, so just to summarize what we've talked about today, we're down to a couple minutes left in our presentation. We've examined why IA is important. We've looked at the causes of ineffective information architecture, and those were our ambiguity, variation, and ignorance. And then how we combat that, or how we resolve that, is through sorting of the information and filtering, right? So actually, this last image here, really these are sorted and filtered very well, right? They're all in their independent locations. Then we can look at our structure, right, which is our taxonomy, and our clarity and classification within that taxonomy. So clarity is our describing metadata, and our classification is grouping it properly. All right, so what we probably have now, if we don't have anything else, is a sweet tooth, or at least you're hungry for lunch after this discussion. But I'd like to talk about a little bit about us, and then we'll move on to look to our question and answer. Okay, so just a little bit about DevFacto. We're happy to help guide you through the world of information architecture if that's something that you need. We have a variety of information architecture engagements that we do with our clients. Typically, an information architecture review, planning of information architecture, an architecture roadmap, or in some cases governance mentoring, because information architecture is a component of governance. When we're building structure around everything, it's a governance thing. So often what we do is we sit on steering committees to help you establish your governance. Okay, so let's open it up to chat, and I'd like to say thank you.